So today I'm going to present or talk about my own practice, which is basically a film-based practice, it's all films based on Saigon, in particular in District 4, although there's a few from another area as well. Just to be able to use my practice as a way to talk about the city and about how I understand the city, my engagement with the city, particularly my engagement as a foreigner, as someone who doesn't come from here, and how I understand that relationship. Okay, cities are often described as singular items, a whole entity. I think we saw the example of Singapore, which is a simplistic city image, which probably originated on the desktop of a branding guru somewhere who was paid vast amounts of money to come up with this city image. But the reality is far more complex. And as this workshop has introduced you to, the complexities of a city that ensures it cannot be seen in such simple terms. For myself, the city image finds its closest definition in the work of Kevin Lynch. In his book, The Image of the City, Lynch refers to the mental image of a city which is held by its citizens. He goes further in defining the notion of the city image as a set of relations between the environment and the observer, who, with great adaptability and in the light of his own purposes, selects, organises and endows with meaning what he sees. This reference to the observer's role in generating the perception of the built environment accommodates differences in perception and experience. And this is really important. So perception and experience are not a singular thing, they're not one thing, they're unique to all of us. As well as similarities. It responds to atmosphere as a co-creative phenomena. However, the impact of cultural biases can impose an image on the city in exactly the same way that we saw earlier with Singapore, that it's this kind of very sterile and empty kind of image of a city. This presentation will provoke an overview of my own investigations and explorations, looking at spaces within Saigon. These investigations, explorations, they're not definitive. They do not try to present a unified and rationalised city, or even rationalised spaces within the city. They're open to interpretation and re-evaluation, in the same way that the spaces and places recorded reinvent themselves every day. This process of repelling rationalisation fascinates me, as it's a reminder of how my own city, which is London, has submitted to order and uniformity so that it no longer accommodates the unusual and alternative visions of urban life. In other words, the alternative has been kind of pushed out of the city or marginalised to the edges of the city. Just to talk a little bit more detail about the sensory image, a more nuanced method of developing an image of an urban place is through our senses. Sumitojo and Pink suggest that our perception of an experience of the world emerges through atmospheres. Atmospheres are ephemeral in nature, and as such their description and definition can be difficult. Their territory in the street is not defined by delineated boundaries, but they merge into each other while gaining some focus or definition from the immediate physical environment. This is a quote from Pink. So Sumitojo and Pink also identify the importance of memory in co-constructing an atmosphere. So our memories and our histories are actually quite critical when we understand what it is that we're looking at. So thus atmosphere's temporality is not about duration, but it's also about the ways in which the past and the future are folded into it. perceived and understood in the present. So our present is basically constructed by the events that have just happened and events that exist in our memories from wherever it is we come from. We also need to acknowledge the role of the viewer as a co-constructor of the built image. The image of the built environment, one that imbues atmosphere with memory and experience. This is particularly interesting when encountering spaces that we've only met in the recent past. And this was quite fundamental to me because, being based here in Saigon, whilst I've been here for 7 years, I'm still an outsider. I'm still a tourist. I was having an interesting conversation with Oliver about this at lunchtime. That's partly an excuse as well, because Vietnamese is a very difficult language to learn. But there's something in the fact that because I don't fully understand the language, I don't fully understand how things operate and how things work. And for me, I quite enjoy that. I quite like the madness of perhaps like the event that we saw going on this morning, which no one really quite knew what was happening and why, but it was an amazing event in itself. So a sensory-based image affords us its development through both visual and sonic experiences. But these also reflect the importance of materiality and light, which combine to create atmospheres. Atmospheres are as emerging from encounters between peoples, materials, events, elements of the environments of which they are part. So in other words, air, light, warmth, sense, smell, taste, etc. all become part of atmospheric experience. The emergent properties of atmosphere are aligned to the emergent properties of the built environment as you move through or along the urban spaces. These events take their place in and around the spaces and define an experience through the multiplicity of activities and physical and visual and temporal arrangement of the spaces. So there's kind of two ways of looking at the city. One building an image through memory, the other building an image through senses, and perhaps they're kind of very closely related. What's important about the understanding of these memories is that they're not images that are formed out of some corporate kind of agenda, or as we've been hearing, this agenda of kind of city building and city planning. So why did I call my presentation Liquid City and Routine? It was kind of, I was just looking at the work that I was doing, and I was thinking about this workshop, and I was thinking that in a sense, one of the things that I always understand about the spaces that I film it's all based on motion. It's all about motion. It's all about moving, either me moving through the spaces or things moving through the spaces. And it seemed to me that the spaces themselves are not fixed. They're not fixed entities. Each day, even during the times during the day, these spaces are changing. They're morphing. And so I kind of saw the city spaces as being something that are constantly in flux or constantly moving. So through this, I've observed and filmed spaces with multiple temporalities. To generalise, which I really don't like to do, but in this case I will, the city operates at multiple speeds of time. And often these blur and merge. The speed of motorbike traffic that's often equated to a river. The pedestrians and the rats that walk and run through the city streets. And the shadows that creep across the city as the day passes. These follow routines, these follow patterns. And in the same way as the tides, I mean, you guys have not been here when we have a high tide and a full moon. The whole city just sort of goes underwater. It's quite extraordinary. But these tides are again kind of, they follow a routine. They're something that occur, and and happen. And as we were hearing in the first conversation, or the first talk this morning, perhaps this is something we need to embrace rather than try and design around or design against. So I see the city as an organism in constant flux, an entity of differing fluidities, such as community, family, play, work, floods, temperature, energy, coffee, probably one here, spatial occupation, and many others. So, to talk a little bit more about the films themselves, my films are a visual reconstitution of experiences I've encountered within the city spaces. These started out, they focus, the ones you're looking at now are all based in District 4, where I did my PhD in the School of Architecture and Urbanism in RMIT in Australia, in Melbourne. But I've also been looking at, though it was impacted quite heavily by the COVID outbreak, Nyar Bay district, which is a district south to the south of the city. And then recently we've just been joined a River Cities network, and we're setting up a series of research projects where we're going to be looking at a much more sensory-based way of mapping and understanding and gathering stories around a short canal which sits between District 4 and District 7. And we're going to interview locals and etc. It's going to be, but it's a big, long, seven-year project, not quite 100 years. My films employ a methodology that emerges and defines itself through the process of recording and making. So I don't set out with an intentional methodology, although I do have set methods, which I then will talk a little bit about, which I employ as I'm working through this. The term reconstitution is a deliberate term. So I see my films as a reconstitution of an experience that I've had when I was there, filming, walking around, etc., etc. And reconstitution is something, somebody said to me the other day, which I thought was an interesting comment, that reconstitution means bringing something back to life in the same way that it existed. But I think there's a fundamental difference. I think reconstitution involves a process. It involves a process which fundamentally changes the thing. So for me it seemed quite an appropriate term, because my process is fundamentally change the visual way, even though temporarily, the time or the sequence is kept intact. I'll explain a little bit of that in a minute if I get time. So I kind of have a set of methods which are not necessarily fixed, but they kind of respond to what I capture. And as I say, the methodology is something which is emergent. It's not something that I go in with an intention of presenting. But there are three kind of main methods that I've employed. There's a static method, a walking method, and a motorbike method. So when I started filming, particularly in District 4, one of the issues I found was actually finding a language and finding a way in which to film such a space. Just so for those of you that come from Australia, District 4 is mainly made up of a very tight network of alleyways. They call them hens, and these are very narrow. I mean, they're maybe 2-3 meters apart, so they're very, very narrow, very kind of tight spaces, and are dominated by families that have lived there for quite some time. For 50, 60 years. So I struggled with ways in which to actually start filming this. So I started looking at CCTV film footage. And it wasn't that I necessarily wanted to be as surreptitious or perhaps as sneaky as CCTV, but I actually was quite interested in the idea of having just a fixed camera view and be able to just watch and see what unfolds within the sequences that I capture. So this was kind of a really important part. It was about letting the spaces speak to me rather than me trying to determine what it is I wanted to get from the spaces, because I didn't really know initially, but also I felt it was much more prevalent, much more kind of relevant to what I'm doing, that the spaces tell me what they're doing. So my general approach is put the camera down, leave it to run as long as it will run until the camera trips up, usually like a full memory or something along those lines. So I get footage sequences of about 20 minutes when I'm filming high definition video. Just as an add-in to this, that when I film all this, I use an iPhone. I don't go and get massive cameras and whatever. So I try to use equipment that is surreptitious and equipment that when the locals see someone filming something on their iPhone, that's something that they do every day. So they're familiar with that, with that process, and it's not something that's unfamiliar or something that's perhaps intrusive. Of course, it is intrusive to an extent, but it's less intrusive and they're more comfortable with it. When I was capturing these static footages, I thought it would be quite interesting to start moving around, and so I invested in a gimbal, which was an electronic device for kind of keeping the camera steady, and started walking around the hens, which gave me a completely different kind of experience. So you have the hens and the people and everything kind of moving within these spaces, but also myself moving through the spaces allowed me to kind of see things in a slightly different way. Then the final kind of main method that I use in terms of recording information is the motorbike. So in Yabe, it's an area that's defined by two streets. One street is more of a traditional kind of vernacular street where all the houses and the shops are built really through community and family needs. So people just build a shop and then they operate that shop and they'll extend it for family purposes, whatever. But it's all very kind of low-rise and small, and not dissimilar to a lot of the smaller shops that you see in this kind of area around here. And the other street is defined by modern apartment blocks, which are kind of the opposite. And you'll see when a bit of footage comes up after this, I think, that you'll see that it gives a very different kind of feel because it's far more removed. It's not very people friendly. The apartment blocks sit back. There's a big hedge to stop people walking into the apartment spaces. It's less Vietnamese. It's more of kind of this generic kind of Western feel. So the motorbike was interesting as well because the motorbike is something that most Vietnamese have grown up on. Their children grow up on motorbikes. Most of the young students here probably all were dropped off at school and picked up from school on motorbikes. They even have little cushions they put on the handlebars of motorbikes so that young kids can sleep on their way back from school. So motorbikes are something which is very much part of the kind of existence of people in this part of the world. And so it seems to me that they do their shopping on motorbikes. If you go to the markets, you'll see people don't park their motorbike and get off and go shopping. They sit on their motorbike and they shop from their motorbike. It's kind of a very interesting way of doing things. And great for those that have shops on the street. But you also see, I'm sure you've probably seen a few, usually guys, sleeping on motorbikes. So they kind of, the Saigon drivers will have their lunch and then they will sleep for a period of time on the motorbike. You obviously see families on motorbike. I think maximum I've seen is 6 people and a dog on one motorbike. But usually you get 3, maybe 4 people on a motorbike. And even house removals on a bike. I saw somebody driving off with a Honda Cub, which is one of the smaller motorbikes, with a fridge freezer on the back, which wasn't tied down. He was just holding onto it and just drove off on a motorbike with one hand, which I'm sure, it's certainly where I come from, he would have got more than 3 meters before being arrested. So I think this is going to run out of time in a minute, so I won't go too much into the editing processes, but as you can see, I kind of heavily produce the images, because what I'm trying to do is recreate the experience of these spaces, recreate the experience that I had within these spaces. And one of the key things when I did my PhD, or one of the kind of areas that came out of this that was for me quite interesting, was this notion of dorsality. So this idea of dorsality is based on the idea that fish have a dorsal fin that sits on the back. We approach and we understand our world purely from a frontal kind of perspective. We see the world from the front. We never ever see the world from behind. Even if we use a mirror or a phone to look behind us, we're only seeing a section of what's behind us. We don't see the 360 degrees, and we never can do. So our whole world and our whole understanding of the world comes from this very frontal view. So for me, the experience of being in an urban space, particularly the Saigon urban spaces, is that it's a 360, it's a spherical 360 degree experience. You've got everything going on all around you. And then there's a writer called Brandon Colvin who uses the term compositional defamiliarization, which I came across a little while back, and I kind of felt maybe it's quite appropriate for what I do. I don't wish to represent the spaces that I film, but I'm creating a defamiliarization which hopefully leads you to the experience of what I do, the places I go. So anyway, I'll shut up there and I'll hand over to Rachel.